Troy, it's interesting. I watch TV sometimes and I'll be flipping the channels and I see a quote unquote worship service on there, and they're doing all sorts of things from dancing and hooting and hollering and all sorts of stuff. And they call it worshiping God.
I've seen that as well. Sometimes people call watching a sunset worship and things like that. People have a distorted view of what worship really means.
And we're not necessarily trying to question their heart. We just question whether or not they're actually following the New Testament authority and how God has showed us and commanded us as the New Testament church how to worship.
And that's the key right there, is the authority when you're talking about worship.
Exactly. And that's the question we actually had come in this week. It says, what are the acts of worship authorized by the New Testament? I love that because it's saying, what do we have authority to do? What has God said is worship to him?
Yeah, this is a big subject, and you can have all kinds of opinions and everything else on this. So you go back to the scriptures, and the scriptures very clearly tell us what the New Testament church did. It begins in Acts chapter 2, and right there from the beginning, and in Acts chapter 2, you start seeing how they came together in fellowship and prayer and breaking bread. And then when you get into other passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 11 through 14, you see Paul talk about all those different acts of worship.
Exactly. And really, when you study the entire New Testament, we can kind of boil it down to 5 acts that we see the New Testament church doing in worship.
Okay, what is the first one?
All right, let me take singing.
Okay.
Colossians chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, as well as Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19, that we are singing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, and it actually tells us what instrument to use. We use our heart as we do so.
Yeah, and once again there in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 15, he talks about singing in the Spirit and singing with understanding.
Exactly. So what's the second one, Troy?
The second one I would say would be the Lord's Supper. None of these, not ranking them in any importance, but the Lord's Supper is central to worship. Once again, going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he talks about that remembrance of that communion that we have.
Oh, exactly. Acts 20, verse 7 is the one I always tend to go to on that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the third one I'll pull out would be the giving, to lay by and store. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1 through 2, that concerning the collection of the saints on the first day of the week, as I've given order to the churches in Galatia.
Exactly.
So do ye. And so we give. And remember, it's the heart, John 4:24. You got to worship him in spirit and in truth.
2 Corinthians.
Yeah, 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 7.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget, go back to Acts chapter 2. They were giving to help one another there.
All right, so what's the fourth one? I'll let you pick.
Prayer. Prayer is so very important. And whenever you think about prayer, once again, it's right there in 1 Corinthians. But also, I like what Paul says to Timothy whenever he says to him in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, therefore I desire that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting.
Oh, yeah. And then I'll take the fifth one, preaching.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, Paul's admonition to Timothy to preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, 2 Timothy 4:2. But, we were talking, you mentioned 1 Corinthians 11 through chapter 14. You look at chapter 14 when it talks about the one prophesying, that's that preaching the teaching, and really goes down into chapter 15 that it can become a none effect to them.
Exactly, and it's all necessary as we read in Romans chapter 10, 14 and forward. And so those are the acts of worship that we see in the New Testament that are examples to us of what we need to do. They're commands for us, what we need to do. And therefore we can follow those and know that we're pleasing God.
And if we do that, we will be the church of the New Testament. We will be the church of Christ.
Amen.